Hi there, folks. I thought it was time I treated you lovely people to another themed book list. And I've been meaning to do this one for some time, but other sort of subjects kept cropping up. And I am going to give you a list of my top 10 historical novels. Now, this has not been easy to compile. I have just spent a great deal of my morning going through my bookshelves to find my favourite historical novels. And what was happening was I kept seeing authors that I particularly like that write historical novels, and I almost did this list on historical fiction authors. But then I decided, no, a book list is better, but I should be talking about the other works of that particular author. And also, at the end of this video, I will give a list of other writers who I think should really have a mention for their historical novels. So here you are. These are my particular favourite historical novels. And as usual, I shall be talking about them in order of publication. So first of all, we're going to start with a Winston Graham novel. So you might guess that I'm talking about not just one novel, but a series of novels. And I'm talking about the Poldark books, the first one being Ross Poldark, published in 1945 and televised at least twice. My favourite was, I think it was in the 1970s or early 80s, with Robin Ellis as Poldark and the lovely Anne Carrot-Rees as Demelza. I think there are 12 in the series, correct me if I'm wrong. Ross Poldark returns to Cornwall after fighting in America, to find that the woman that he was in love with is now engaged to be married to his cousin, with whom he has a pretty tricky relationship. And his father is now dead, his estate is kind of on its last legs, and so he's in a very difficult position. He befriends people that are below his sort of landowning status and rescues this poor urchin girl called Demelza, who he takes in and employs as his maid and rapidly falls in love with. So that's the basic beginning plot of the first novel, and it goes from there right through, as I say, 12 books. Set in the 1780s and goes right through the following decades of this, and becomes a huge family saga. His relationship with Demelza, his relationship with Elizabeth, and the sort of rivalries there, and the rivalries between his family and the family of Warleggans. It's so well written, and Winston Graham is was a really good historical writer. There goes the dog. Hugely well researched. I must mention a couple of his other books. I've mentioned this one before. It's called The Walking Stick. It's a bit of a thriller, and I really loved it. It was one of those books that I couldn't put down. And another one I should mention, this is a historical one set in the 16th century. It's called The Grove of Eagles, and this is quite an old hardback edition. Again, it's a kind of family saga, again set in Cornwall, about a family when England was under threat by the Spanish and the Spanish Armada. So that's really good. But I recommend looking out for any Winston Graham novel. He's a prolific writer. There are lots of them. So if you've read all the Poldark books, then do have a look for his other books as well. My next book, again, I've mentioned this before a few times, and I don't have a copy, but it had a very lasting effect on me. I read it, I think, when I was in my late teens. It's The Source by James A. Mitchener, an extraordinary novel, pretty long, if I remember rightly. It was published in 1965. It's a multi-timeline novel. The kind of contemporary part of the novel is about two archaeologists at a dig in Israel, and through their findings, each time they find an old artifact, we go into a chapter telling that bit of history from the Jewish people. It's absolutely extraordinary. If you're at all interested in the history of the Jewish people, then this book is a must. It's so well researched, right from pre-monotheistic days through the birth of Israel, etc. It's absolutely fascinating and really well written and enthralling. So it's one of those books that just stayed with me forever, and I think influenced my work as a writer in many ways. As I like, if you've read my books, you'll know I like writing in multi-timeline. Not quite as epic as The Source, but that's the kind of book I really like to write. So there you go, The Source, James A. Mitchener, fantastic novel. And of course, really, I think it's the only book I've read of James A. Mitchener, so there's a hole in my bookshelf that needs to be filled. Let me know which of your Mitchener books are the best, and I will look out for them. The next book on my list, again, I don't have a copy. I read this some time ago. It was published in 1980, and it's The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. And it was translated into English in 1983 by William Weaver. Extraordinary novel, considering that this was Umberto Eco's debut novel. It's set in 1327. It's set in a monastery in northern Italy. It's about a Franciscan friar called William of Baskerville who arrives at this monastery. It's a Benedictine abbey, actually, to attend a theological discussion. And when he gets there, he finds that a monk has recently been found dead. And he is asked, because he is a former inquisitor, he is asked to look into this murder. And he gets involved into this very dark little gothic ambience of this abbey as more monks get murdered, disappear. And he finds himself entering a dark world of metaphysics, symbolism, secrets. So, yeah, again, really enthralling. If you like dark Gothic novels, especially those set in the medieval period, then this is definitely one for you. The next one is another series of books that I absolutely loved. And she is one of my favourite authors for her ability to create characters that you really, really care about. The author is Elizabeth Jane Howard, and the first novel in this series of books was The Light Years, published in 1990. Both my mother and I just absolutely loved these books. We sort of went through them really quickly. They are so readable. The first novel starts out in the late 1930s, just as the Second World War is looming. And it tells the story of the Cazalet family. They're a middle-class family who live in Sussex. It's called The Light Years for a reason. They are still in that period where life is all seems good, everything seems innocent and lovely, but we have the spectre of the war approaching. And what I love about these books, they're not particularly plot driven. They are incredibly unputdownable because of the characters. They are the most character driven books I've ever read. You just get so involved. And the Cazalet family is there's quite a lot of them. There's a lot of cousins and their relationships and their hopes and fears and difficulties, etc. And to go through the rest of them, the second one is Marking Time, which begins at the beginning of the Second World War in 1939. As it says on the back, the sunlit days of childish games and family meals are over as the shadows of war roll in to cloud the lives of one English family. At home place, the windows are blacked out and food is becoming scarce. So there we go into the next phase of this family and how they cope with the war years. The third one is Confusion. And this, we're still in the war period. And it says on the back, not a shot is fired in these pages, but we are made to understand how war invades the body and the spirit. A birth, a death, adultery, a stumbling marriage, an upper middle class family takes shape with cinematic sharpness. That was from the Daily Telegraph. And then the fourth one is Casting Off. These pretty old books, you can tell they've been well read. This is after the war. So we see, how they slowly kind of get themselves together after all the consequences of the war. Some of the children who we saw in the earlier books are now grown up and they're forming their own relationships and trying to build their own lives. And then we have the fifth and final one, which was published much later in 2013, and this is All Change. And we're now into the 1950s. And so we're seeing the ones who were children in the early books, really it's very much now about them and their relationships and how they deal with their marriages and children. And the older ones are now still reeling from the effects of the war and trying to cope with the new modern world. It's amazing. You just think it's just about a middle class family going through the war years and that's it. But it's just so well written, so you become so engaged with the characters, and that is what I love about Elizabeth Jane Howard. And three other books that I read of hers are, I won't go into these, but there's Falling. That's about a man in late middle age. There's The Beautiful Visit, about a woman about to go on a voyage, and Love All, which is about love and absence. I love Elizabeth Jane Howard, and I highly recommend the Cazalet quintet of books if you haven't read them. In my next favourite historical novel, we go back to the First World War, and this is Birdsong by Sebastian Faulkes, and there certainly are shots fired in this one, and this was published in 1993. And it's not all set in the First World War because it's actually a dual timeline book. There is a part of the novel that is set in the 1970s, the granddaughter of the main character in the First World War. And she is trying to find out about him and his experience. This was one of those few books that actually made me cry. Real tears. I mean, seriously. It's one of those books that really puts you in touch on a deeply emotional level of the tragedy of war, the real heartbreak of war, like no other book I've read does. There is a certain passage set during the Somme, which just had me in pieces, basically. And so, but it's one of those books, although it's heartbreaking, it's an important book, if we don't want to forget just the terrible, terrible consequences of what war does to people. And there's also a love story at the heart of it too. It's been adapted for stage, radio and television. I saw the television version, which was very good. Very, very moving. And if you like books set in the war, I highly recommend Sebastian Faulkes, Birdsong. And I have read 2 of his other books. One was A Week in December. Basically follows the lives of 7 different characters on one particular week, and A Possible Life, which is quite a strange novel, again about several different people. I didn't get on with these quite as well as Birdsong, but there you are. If you want to dip into Sebastian Faulkes, well worth dipping into. And here comes the dog. Hey, here she is, come to tell me it's dinner time, no doubt. It's not actually dinner time, it's treat time, isn't it? Hey, she gets a little she gets a little chew at this time of the day to keep her busy. She will always tell me what time of day it is. It's usually about an hour early. Yeah, little rascal, yeah. So, where are we next? My next novel, which I absolutely loved, and another book I found it difficult to put down, Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. This was published in 1997. It's an incredibly engaging story. The premise sounds very difficult. It tells the story of a young woman. Starts out, she and her sister as children are sold by their father. She is trained to become a geisha. Her sister is taken to a brothel. And basically it tells the story in her narrative, in first person, the story of her life as she trains to become a geisha and goes through the period in Japan before, during and after the Second World War. Of course, geisha women were women who were trained in the art of performing, entertainment, singing, hostessing, conversation, to be kind of employed, as it were, as those kind of people at certain events. And this whole story, the story of this woman, starts in 1929, takes us right through the war years, really gives an insight into that world of what it was like to be a geisha, the exploitation that was involved, the highs, the lows. Very, very engaging and difficult at times, but such a good read. So if you're interested in that part of Japanese culture, I really highly recommend this book. My next book I absolutely loved, and you will love it too if you have any interest in the history of England, and in particular the history of London. And the book is London by Edward Rutherford. It's a novel, and but it tells the history of London right from before London was even existed, right from the time of the river we now know as the Thames, right through until the 1990s. Basically what he does is he kind of tells the story of London, almost like a kind of biography, but it tells for each period, for each time period, he tells a different story. So you just get a build-up of the sort of ongoing history of the city. And it's really, really engaging, even though you're not following, obviously, a main character right through the novel. Each story is really fascinating, and I found it difficult to put down. And it goes through all the sort of main parts of London history. So we go from, it starts with the river and ends with the river, and then you go through Londinium, the Roman period, of course, and there's chapters called the Conqueror, the Tower, and then later on there's the Whorehouse and London Bridge, Hampton Court, London's Fire, covering the Great Fire of London, goes right through to 19th century with the Crystal Palace, and then the suffragettes and then the Blitz in the war, and it's just fascinating. And I loved it in particular because I love London. I lived there for 20 years and worked in London for a long time. I got to know the central part, particularly the West End of London, very, very well. I left London basically because the crowds and the commuting got a bit too much for me, and I do love the countryside as well. But I love going back to London. I love its history. It's got such a fascinating history. So this book was right up my street. And he's also written similar books on other places such as Paris and Dublin, which I'd like to read that. I have ancestry in Dublin. So yeah, if you're at all interested in the history of London, this book is a must read. And in case I didn't say it before, it was published in 1997. My next book brought this particular writer to great prominence, and a wonderful television series, and it's Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, published in 2009, and of course it tells the story in 3 parts of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's kind of right-hand man. Now I've read Wolf Hall and I've read the second one, Bring Up the Bodies, and I have to admit I have not yet got up the courage to read the third in the trilogy, The Mirror and the Light, which of course tells of the fall from grace of Thomas Cromwell and his eventual execution, because that's going to be really difficult reading, and I believe Hilary Mantel has said or found it difficult to write, but I must read that at some point. Of course, sadly we lost Hilary Mantel much too early. Just a very interesting writer. It took me a while when I started to read Wolf Hall. It took me a while to get into her style. It's kind of sort of stark kind of style. She has a very unique way of writing, but I just loved it once I got into it. I absolutely loved this. It tells the story of Thomas Cromwell, and it tells it in the present tense, which always brings you very much, it gives a kind of more immediate feel and engaging feel. And of course, one of the interesting things about this whole trilogy is that while history has painted Thomas Cromwell as a kind of rather bleak figure, a kind of thug, as it were, she gives much more of a sensitive picture of this man who really had to tread a dangerous path being in the court of Henry VIII. So she gives a very different, although she doesn't paint him as a hero, as always a sympathetic character, but she does give a more human side of him. And it's absolutely fascinating. If you haven't read this trilogy and you're at all interested in the Tudor history, and you know, if you want a really interesting, well-written insight into this complex man, then I highly recommend that you read Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, and no doubt, though I have to yet read it myself, The Mirror and the Light. Excellent work. Now, my regular viewers will know that I'm a big fan of this next particular writer, so it was very, very difficult to choose my favourite out of all her works, and I'm not going to go through them all, but the writer is Philippa Gregory, and the book I've chosen is The Taming of the Queen. Now, Philippa Gregory, of course, is well known for writing many books about the Tudor kings and queens and mothers and wives, and lots of other books, not necessarily set in the Tudor period. And I'm still going through the Tideland trilogy as well. Lots of other books. She is such a prolific writer. She's an amazingly prolific writer. I can't keep up with her. But of her Tudor books, this is actually my favourite. It's not, I don't think it's necessarily her best known one, but I just really enjoyed this one. It's about Henry VIII's last wife, Catherine Parr. It was published in 2015. It's a very, very interesting take on Catherine Parr. Again, another person who had to tread a very dangerous ground. And, you know, imagine Henry VIII, he's been through 5 wives, and you're the one that he next asks to marry. So she's a young widow. She has a secret lover who she, you know, does not want to divulge, and it's a dangerous world. But she manages to survive being the wife of Henry VIII, even though she has beliefs and ideologies that could be dangerous for her. She's a highly independent woman. She's the first woman to publish under her own name in English. That's an extraordinary thing for a woman of this time. And there are people out there who want to accuse her of heresy. So she treads a very, very dangerous path and survives. It's a really, really interesting take on the life of this woman. And as usual with Philippa Gregory, extraordinarily well researched and well written. So I just found this very interesting. An intelligent woman thrown into this world of being the wife of Henry VIII. So yeah, I just find that particularly a fascinating premise. So yeah, I do recommend this one. But I always love Philippa Gregory. Not everybody likes her, I know, but though I think probably The Other Boleyn Girl was a good one. The Red Queen I particularly liked. The mother of Henry VII, that was a really good one too. So yeah, there's lots to choose from. And last on my list is another very prolific writer, another highly intelligent and well-researched writer who I've only just recently started to get into, and I've got 2 more of his in my TBR too. And this one is Fools and Mortals, and it's by Bernard Cornwell. And it was published, this one's fairly recent, in 2017. I love this book because one of the main characters is Shakespeare and Shakespeare's brother. So it's, of course, therefore set in Elizabethan London. And it's basically, the main character is Richard Shakespeare, Shakespeare's brother, who is one of the players in the theatre company. And of course, Richard's career is dominated by his older brother, William, and there's a bit of sibling rivalry between the two of them. And a manuscript goes missing, a very important one, and Richard falls under suspicion, and he has to go and try and find out what has happened to this, and it kind of becomes a bit of a sort of mystery thriller, almost detective type book, and I just loved it. It's really good. You know, obviously a topic that I'm always interested in. I'm always going to be interested in books that are around Shakespeare and that period. Bernard Cornwell is an amazingly prolific writer, as I said. He wrote the Sharp series, which kind of goes on and on and on, and lots of other books. As I say, I've got 2 more of his lined up. Another one of his that I've read is Gallows Thief, which is a kind of other detective-y type one, but this time set in 19th century. I'm looking forward to reading more of his. I actually met him once. He was doing a talk at some sort of event that I went to, and he did a really good talk, and I went up to him afterwards and said, because he writes such a lot, and he talked about he actually has a full-time job, and I went up to him afterwards and I said, how do you manage to find the time to write, because this is something I've always struggled with. And he said he suffered from insomnia and he writes at night, and oh, great. Of course, that doesn't work for me because I can't function if I don't sleep. But it was very interesting to know that not only does he write prolifically, but he works as well. Amazing. Anyway, there you go. That's my list. Now, as I said, as I went through my bookshelf, I kept looking at authors and thinking, oh, I'd like to put those authors on my list too, but I couldn't choose a book, or the other books were just ones I needed to put into the top 10. So I'm just going to mention a few more authors as honourable mentions here. Let's do them in alphabetical order. So first one, Rory Clements. He also does kind of historical whodunits, really. He has a series of books about, again, another sort of Shakespeare connection, about John Shakespeare, who works as a spy in the Elizabethan period. Those are really interesting. Another interesting writer, I've only read one of hers, is Victoria Hislop. If you're in England, you'll know her as the wife of Ian Hislop. She's a really good writer. The one I've read of hers is The Island, which is about a leper colony, and that was really interesting. Then, of course, I have to mention Margaret Mitchell as the writer of Gone with the Wind, and I almost put Gone with the Wind on my list because it's one of my favourite historical novels, but I've talked about it so often before that I decided to give it a miss this time. Another favourite of mine is Kate Morton. She writes a lot of kind of dual or multi-timeline novels, kind of in the same vein as my own writing, often centred around an old house, and usually sort of family saga types. They're really good. And then there's Kate Moss. I really like her writing. They're quite long books. Usually many of hers are set in medieval France. Then there is C.J. Sansom, again another historical whodunit kind of book. Books. There's a whole series of books. I can't remember the character's name, but I read one of them, Revelation. That was really good. I want to read more of his. And finally, I want to mention Sir Walter Scott, who was a late 18th and early 19th century writer who wrote historical novels set in the medieval and Tudor periods. I've read at least 2 of his novels. I've read Ivanhoe, which is a medieval one and is probably his best known one. And I've also read Kenilworth, which is really interesting. It's set in the Elizabethan period. It's set mainly at Kenilworth Castle, which isn't that far from here, and one of my favourite castles, by the way. And it tells the story leading up to Queen Elizabeth's famous visit to Kenilworth Castle. So that's Sir Walter Scott. And I should also mention that Charles Dickens, of course, wrote 2 historical novels, and obviously set before his time. They were set in the 18th century, and of course they were Barnaby Rudge, one of my favourites, and A Tale of Two Cities, set during the French Revolution, of course. So there we go. Those are some honourable mention authors I have really loved. I just want to talk about why why a lot of people love historical novels so much. The funny thing is, I wasn't particularly interested in history at school. History lessons were a big bore. Particularly when I was at school, it wasn't really taught very well. It was just dates and battles, and it was just very boring. I actually became interested in history after leaving school, when I started tracing my ancestry. And my uncle had done a lot of that. That was on my father's side, but I started tracing a lot of my mother's side of the family, and I just became interested in that. And actually tracing one's ancestry is a really good way of getting interested in history, because you're thinking about the background of these people that were your family. And I also then started looking at the family tree of the royal family, because there's something about the way family trees worked that always fascinated me, and that's why I eventually became a professional genealogist. That's what I do, that's my living. So from there I started reading history books. I actually started reading history textbooks, and I basically taught myself a lot of history. And then of course I started to read a lot of historical fiction, although I'd first read, I think probably my first book that I read that was historical fiction was Gone with the Wind, which is American history, not English history. But I also read, I think it was the book Simon by Rosemary Sutcliffe, that was set during the English Civil War. And then, of course, James A. Mitchener's The Source, and so on. And I've loved historical fiction ever since. But it has to be really well researched. So it has to have a lot of historical fact behind it. It has to be believable for me. And it has to be intelligent. I get very annoyed at so-called historical romances that sacrifice historical integrity for sex and sensationalism. I have been known to... I very nearly threw a book across the room fairly recently because it was so historically inaccurate. It was stupid. I'm not going to name it, but it went straight into the charity pile. I'd read the first 2 chapters and had enough of it. But I won't read that kind of historical fiction. It has to be well researched. There has to be historical fact behind, because historical fiction, we don't know what these people did or said much of the time, but the writer has to have some knowledge of the time, the background, and what these people quite possibly might have said and done to weave a really good story. So for me, that's absolutely essential. But I think, the reason we do like historical fiction, it gives us another place to go. I think sometimes we can get a little bit tired of our own contemporary world, maybe see too much of it on the news, and it's nice to sort of look back and look at other people's lives and how they've gone through terrible times and come out the other side and survived. And I think it, in a way, although some historical novels can be quite difficult to read through, such as books set during war, etc., it still can give us a feeling of hope that we always come out of the other side of it somehow. And of course, if you're at all interested in history, then historical fiction is really good to read. So there we go. I hope you've enjoyed that list. I hope that's given you a few ideas. I know most of these are set in British history. There are 3 that are not, but of course, you know, that's where I live, and that's probably going to be mainly my interest. I hope that's given you a few ideas to put on your TBR. If you want to see another list, I will put up something up here somewhere, a link to another book list that you might be interested in here. And of course, do please subscribe if you haven't already. Please comment, give me your favourite historical novels and why you like them. I'm always interested to hear. And thank you for watching and being subscribers. I really do appreciate your following me and giving me such lovely comments, and I do read every single one. Now, where's that little dog? There she is at the bottom of the stairs. It's one of her favourite places. There she is. So there we go. Have a great weekend, everybody. From me and Tilly. We will see you again very soon. Bye for now.